They call me a snitch now. A rat. A piece of shit who sold out his own kind for a lighter sentence and a spot in witness protection. Maybe they're right. Maybe that's exactly what I am. But if telling the truth about what really goes on behind those concrete walls makes me a snitch, then I'll wear that label with pride. Because the truth needs to come out. The truth about who really runs the show in California's prison system. The truth about the man they call the Ghost. A name that most people, even most convicts, have never heard. The truth about how power really works when you're locked in a cage with the most dangerous men in America. My name is Marcus Webb, and I spent 8 years as a member of the Peckerwood gang in the California prison system. 8 years learning the rules, following orders, and believing I knew how things worked. 8 years before I discovered that everything I thought I knew was a lie. I wasn't born into this life. I wasn't some hardened criminal who grew up on the streets. I was a suburban kid from Riverside who made a series of stupid decisions that landed me in Corcoran State Prison with a 10-year sentence for armed robbery. 22 years old, scared shitless, and about as prepared for prison life as a goldfish is prepared for the ocean. The first thing you learn in California prison is that you need protection. The second thing you learn is that protection comes with a price. For white inmates, that protection usually comes from one of two sources: the Aryan Brotherhood or the Peckerwoods. The AB is the premier white gang, the ones with the real power and connections. But they're selective, and they don't take just anyone. The Peckerwoods, on the other hand, will take almost any white convict willing to follow their rules and prove their loyalty. They're like the minor league version of the Aryan Brotherhood, less prestigious, but still dangerous, and still necessary for survival. My recruitment happened on my third day at Corcoran. I was standing in the chow line trying to keep my head down and avoid eye contact with anyone, when this huge guy with swastika tattoos covering his arms stepped up behind me. "You're the new fish from Riverside," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, not trusting my voice. "Name's Tank. I run the Peckerwood crew on this yard. You got two choices, fish. You can roll with us, follow our rules, and we'll make sure nobody fucks with you. Or you can try to go it alone and end up getting passed around like a party favor." I looked around the chow hall. Blacks with blacks, Mexicans with Mexicans, whites with whites. The racial divisions were absolute, enforced by violence and tradition going back decades. There was no middle ground, no neutrality. "What do I have to do?" I asked. Tank smiled, but it wasn't a friendly expression. "First, you prove you're not a punk. Second, you prove you're loyal. Third, you learn to follow orders without asking questions. You do those 3 things, and you'll do your time in peace." The proving you're not a punk part came that afternoon during yard time. Tank pointed to a Mexican guy standing by the weight pile and told me to go start a fight with him. Didn't matter that I didn't know the guy. Didn't matter that he hadn't done anything to me. It was a test, and failing tests in prison can get you killed. I walked over to the Mexican guy, who was probably 15 years older than me and had arms like tree trunks from years of lifting weights. He saw me coming and knew what was about to happen. Prison has its own language, and violence is the most fluent dialect. "You got a problem, EC?" he asked, setting down the weight he'd been holding. "Yeah," I said, my heart pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. "I got a problem with you being on our side of the yard." He smiled and shook his head. "Fucking fish don't know no better." Then he swung at me. The fight lasted maybe 30 seconds. He was bigger, stronger, and more experienced, but I was younger and desperate. I took his punches and kept swinging back, kept getting up every time he knocked me down. Finally, the guards broke it up and we both got dragged to the hole. When I got out of solitary 2 weeks later, Tank was waiting for me. "You did good, fish. You took your lumps and kept fighting. That Mexican respects you now, and so do we." That's how I became a Peckerwood. Not through some elaborate initiation ritual, but by proving I was willing to take a beating for the gang. It was the first of many beatings I'd take and many more I'd give out. Over the next few months, Tank taught me the rules: who to respect, who to avoid, who to target, how to make weapons from everyday items, how to hide contraband, how to read the subtle signs that indicated when violence was about to erupt. But more importantly, he taught me about the hierarchy. The Peckerwoods had their own internal structure, with Tank as the leader on our yard. Above him were the shot callers for the entire institution. Above them were the regional leaders who coordinated between different prisons. And above all of them, supposedly, were the leaders of the Aryan Brotherhood. The AB runs everything, Tank explained during one of our conversations in his cell. They make the big decisions, set the policies, decide who lives and who dies. We're like their little brothers. We follow their lead, and they make sure we get a piece of the action. It made sense. The Aryan Brotherhood was legendary in the prison system, known for their ruthlessness and their ability to reach out and touch someone even in protective custody. If you crossed the AB, you were marked for death, and that death sentence would follow you to whatever prison they transferred you to. But as the months turned into years, I started noticing things that didn't quite fit with that narrative. The first thing I noticed was the communications. In prison, information is power, and the most powerful gangs have the most sophisticated communication networks. Messages get passed through visits, through mail, through corrupt guards, through new arrivals and transfers. The AB definitely had their network, but there was another network operating alongside it. Messages that came from sources nobody talked about, orders that arrived through channels nobody could identify. Sometimes these messages would contradict AB directives, and when that happened, it was the mysterious messages that took precedence. I started paying attention to who received these special communications. It wasn't always the obvious leaders, the guys with the most tattoos or the biggest reputations. Sometimes it was quiet guys who kept to themselves and didn't seem to have much influence on the yard. But when these quiet guys spoke, people listened. When they made suggestions, those suggestions became policy. When they expressed displeasure with someone, that someone found themselves in serious trouble. The second thing I noticed was the money. Prison gangs make money through extortion, drug dealing, gambling, and protection rackets. In theory, all of this revenue was supposed to flow up to the AB leadership, but I started seeing patterns that suggested some of the money was going somewhere else. Tank would collect tribute from various inmates and businesses on the yard, then pass most of it up the chain. But every few weeks, he'd set aside a particular envelope and give it to a guy named Crow to handle. Crow wasn't anyone special as far as I could tell, just another lifer doing time for murder. But he had access to resources that didn't match his apparent status in the gang hierarchy. The third thing I noticed was the protection. Certain inmates who should have been targets based on their crimes or their backgrounds, seemed to be untouchable. They weren't members of any gang, they didn't have obvious connections to powerful people, but nobody messed with them. When I asked Tank about it, he'd just say they were hands-off and refused to explain further. It took me almost 3 years to piece together what was really happening. 3 years of watching, listening, and slowly building relationships with people who had access to information I didn't. The breakthrough came when I got transferred to Pelican Bay. Pelican Bay is where California sends its most dangerous inmates, the ones who are considered too violent or too influential for regular prisons. It's also where the real power brokers in the prison system end up. My first week at Pelican Bay, I was approached by a guy named Flores. Eddie was a lifer, been in the system for over 20 years, and had a reputation as someone who knew everything about everyone. He was also rumored to be connected to people outside the usual gang structures. "You're Tank's boy from Corcoran," he said as we walked the yard together. "Word is you're smart, observant, good qualities in here." I didn't know where he was going with this, so I just nodded and kept walking. "You ever wonder why Tank always seemed to know things before they happened?" Eddie asked. "Why he never got caught up in the big sweeps? Why his operations always seemed to run smoother than everyone else's?" I had wondered about that, actually. Tank had an uncanny ability to avoid trouble, to know when to lay low and when to make moves. I'd attributed it to experience and street smarts. "Tank's got a benefactor," Eddie continued. "Someone who looks out for him, gives him information, protects his interests. Someone who operates above the gang level, above the politics and the racial divisions." "Who?" Eddie stopped walking and looked around to make sure nobody was within earshot. "They call him the Ghost. Been operating in the system for over 30 years, but nobody knows his real name. Nobody knows what he looks like. Nobody even knows if he's actually an inmate or someone on the outside. That's impossible. You can't run operations in prison without people knowing who you are. That's what everyone thinks. That's what makes him so effective. He works through intermediaries, through people who don't even know they're working for him. He's got influence with the guards, with the administration, with people in Sacramento. When the Ghost wants something done, it gets done." Eddie went on to explain what he knew about the Ghost's network. It wasn't organized like a traditional gang with clear hierarchies and territorial boundaries. Instead, it was more like a web, with the ghost at the center sending out instructions through multiple layers of intermediaries. Some of these intermediaries were gang members from various organizations: Aryan Brotherhood, Peckerwoods, Mexican Mafia, Bloods, Crips. Others were apparently legitimate people: lawyers, social workers, family members of inmates. All of them had been recruited or coerced into serving the ghost's interests, often without knowing the full scope of what they were involved in. The genius of it, Eddie explained, is that nobody has the complete picture except the ghost himself. Each person only knows their small part of the operation. Even if someone gets caught or decides to cooperate with authorities, they can't bring down the whole network because they don't know how the whole network operates. This sounded like conspiracy theory bullshit to me, but Eddie seemed convinced. And over the following weeks, as I paid closer attention to the dynamics on the Pelican Bay yard, I started seeing evidence that supported his claims. Decisions that should have been made by gang leaders were being influenced by outside sources. Conflicts that should have erupted into violence were being resolved through mysterious negotiations. Resources were being distributed in ways that didn't follow the usual patterns of gang politics. And then I met him. It was about 6 months into my stay at Pelican Bay. I was working a job in the prison library, cataloging books and helping inmates with research for their legal cases. It was quiet work that suited me, and it gave me access to information and conversations that I wouldn't normally be exposed to. He came into the library on a Tuesday afternoon, an older white guy with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He looked like a retired college professor, not like someone who belonged in a maximum security prison. He was soft-spoken, polite, and seemed genuinely interested in helping other inmates with their legal research. His name, according to his ID badge, was Robert Morrison. He'd been transferred from some minimum security facility, supposedly for his own protection after some kind of incident. He kept to himself, didn't associate with any of the gangs, and seemed to spend most of his time reading and writing. But I started noticing things about Morrison that didn't add up. Despite being new to Pelican Bay, he seemed to know everyone. Inmates who'd never spoken to him before would nod respectfully when they passed him in the corridors. Guards treated him with unusual deference. Even the gang leaders seemed to regard him with something approaching respect. More importantly, I noticed that things changed after Morrison arrived. Conflicts that had been brewing for months suddenly got resolved. Inmates who'd been marked for violence found themselves under mysterious protection. The flow of contraband shifted in ways that benefited previously marginal players while hurting some of the established power brokers. It took me another month to work up the courage to approach him directly. I waited until we were alone in the library one evening, both of us working on legal research for other inmates. "You're him, aren't you?" I said quietly, not looking up from the law book I was pretending to read. "I'm who?" he replied, his voice mild and curious. "The ghost. The guy who really runs things around here." Morrison set down his pen and looked at me for a long moment. His eyes, which had seemed kind and grandfatherly before, suddenly looked like they could see right through me. "That's an interesting theory," he said finally. "What makes you think that?" "The patterns. The way things change when you're around. The way people react to you even though you're supposedly just some nobody transferred from a minimum security facility." Morrison nodded slowly. "You're observant. That can be a valuable quality or a dangerous one depending on how you use it. Are you going to have me killed for figuring it out?" To my surprise, Morrison laughed. "No, son. If I wanted you dead, you'd already be dead. The fact that you're sitting here talking to me suggests that you might be useful for something else." That conversation was the beginning of my education into how power really works in the California prison system. Over the following months, Morrison gradually revealed pieces of his operation, testing my loyalty and my discretion at each step. The truth was more complex and more impressive than anything Eddie Flores had described. Morrison wasn't just some master manipulator pulling strings from his prison cell. He was part of a network that extended far beyond the prison walls, involving people in law enforcement, politics, business, and organized crime. "The prison system isn't separate from society," Morrison explained during one of our late-night conversations in the library. "It's a reflection of society, a concentrated version of all the same power structures and corruption that exist on the outside. People think that when someone gets sent to prison, they lose all their influence and connections. But that's only true for people who didn't have much influence to begin with. Morrison had been many things before he became the ghost. A lawyer who represented organized crime figures. A political consultant who specialized in campaigns where the outcome mattered more than the methods. A businessman who understood that sometimes the most profitable ventures existed in legal gray areas. He'd been sent to prison 15 years earlier on a tax evasion conviction that was really the result of a larger political scandal. The conviction was supposed to destroy his influence and send a message to others who might be tempted to operate in similar gray areas. Instead, Morrison used his time in prison to build something new. He studied the gang structures, learned how information flowed, identified the key pressure points and vulnerabilities. Then he began carefully recruiting assets and building networks that operated according to his vision, rather than the crude tribal loyalties that had dominated prison politics for decades. The gangs think in terms of race and territory, Morrison told me. That's their strength and their weakness. It gives them identity and solidarity, but it also limits their thinking and creates unnecessary conflicts. I think in terms of interests and objectives, much more efficient. Morrison's network didn't replace the existing gang structures. It operated above them and through them. Gang leaders who cooperated with his directives found their operations running more smoothly, their members better protected, their conflicts resolved more favorably. Gang leaders who opposed him found themselves facing problems they couldn't solve through traditional methods. The key to Morrison's power was information. His network included people in every major institution in California, the prison system, law enforcement, the courts, the legislature, various regulatory agencies. These people provided intelligence about upcoming investigations, policy changes, personnel transfers, budget allocations, all the kinds of advance warning that could mean the difference between success and disaster for criminal enterprises. In exchange for this information, Morrison's network provided services that couldn't be obtained through normal channels. Favorable, judicial decisions, evidence that disappeared from police custody, witnesses who decided not to testify, regulatory approvals that should have been denied. It's not corruption in the traditional sense, Morrison explained. It's more like a parallel system of governance that operates alongside the official system. Sometimes the two systems work together. Sometimes they're in conflict, but they're always aware of each other. The genius of Morrison's approach was that it was almost impossible to investigate or prosecute. Unlike traditional criminal organizations which operated through clear hierarchies and formal membership structures, Morrison's network was deliberately diffuse and compartmentalized. Most of the people involved didn't even realize they were part of a larger organization. A prison guard who occasionally passed messages between inmates might think he was just doing favors for people who paid him well. A court clerk who made sure certain files got misplaced might think she was helping out a lawyer who'd been kind to her family. A legislator who supported certain budget allocations might think he was responding to legitimate constituent concerns. None of them would understand that their individual actions were part of a coordinated strategy directed by someone they'd never met and might never have heard of. The beauty of it, Morrison said, is that even if law enforcement figured out that something like this existed, they wouldn't know how to attack it. They're trained to think in terms of organizations they can chart on a whiteboard, with clear lines of authority and communication. This doesn't work that way. My role in Morrison's network started small. He would ask me to pay attention to certain inmates, to note their visitors and their mail, to report on their conversations and associations. He presented this as intelligence gathering for the general safety of the prison population, and initially I believed that was all it was. But gradually the assignments became more specific and more complex. I was asked to deliver messages to people on other yards, messages that seemed innocuous, but that often preceded significant changes in gang alliances or power structures. I was asked to identify inmates who might be willing to cooperate with authorities, information that Morrison claimed he needed to protect ongoing operations. Eventually, I was asked to help recruit new assets for the network, young inmates who showed promise, guards who seemed susceptible to corruption, visitors who might be willing to carry messages or contraband in exchange for money or other favors. I told myself that I was just trying to survive, that playing along with Morrison's requests was the price of staying alive and unharmed in a dangerous environment, and to some extent, that was true. Morrison's protection was real and valuable. Inmates under his protection didn't get stabbed in the yard or beaten in their cells. They got better job assignments, better housing, access to contraband that made prison life more bearable. But I also started enjoying the power and the knowledge. There's something intoxicating about knowing secrets that other people don't know, about being part of something larger and more sophisticated than the crude tribal politics that most inmates were trapped in. For almost 2 years, I served as one of Morrison's key lieutenants at Pelican Bay. I helped coordinate communications between different yards, managed relationships with corrupt guards, and supervised the recruitment of new network members. I was good at it, and Morrison rewarded my effectiveness with greater responsibility and greater access to the inner workings of his operation. But the more I learned about the network, the more disturbed I became by its scope and its impact. Morrison's influence extended far beyond prison walls. He had assets in district attorneys' offices who could influence prosecution decisions. He had assets in police departments who could ensure that certain investigations went nowhere. He had assets in regulatory agencies who could make problems disappear for businesses that paid the right fees. The network wasn't just about making prison life easier for its members. It was about corrupting the entire criminal justice system in ways that allowed serious criminals to avoid consequences for their actions, while innocent people got caught up in investigations and prosecutions that served Morrison's interests rather than justice. I watched Morrison destroy the life of a prosecutor who was getting too close to exposing one of his operations. The prosecutor didn't even know Morrison existed, but through a series of carefully orchestrated moves, Morrison arranged for evidence to be planted that suggested the prosecutor was taking bribes from drug dealers. The prosecutor lost his job, his reputation, and his family before the truth came out, and by then it was too late to undo the damage. I watched him arrange for the murder of a prison guard who had stumbled onto information about the network and was threatening to expose it. The guard was killed in what appeared to be a random robbery outside his home, but I knew Morrison had ordered the hit and arranged for it to be carried out by gang members who owed him favors. Most disturbing of all, I learned that Morrison's network was involved in facilitating crimes that had nothing to do with prison operations: drug trafficking, human trafficking, money laundering, political corruption. All of it coordinated and protected by the information and influence network that Morrison had built over his 15 years in prison. The breaking point came when Morrison asked me to help set up a fellow inmate named David Chen. Chen was a financial crimes expert who'd been convicted of embezzling millions from a pension fund. He'd kept his mouth shut during his trial and sentencing, but Morrison had learned that Chen was preparing to cooperate with federal investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence. Chen knows too much about some of our external operations, Morrison explained. If he talks, it could bring down people who are important to our network. We need to make sure he doesn't get the chance to talk. Morrison wanted me to arrange for Chen to be killed in a way that would look like gang violence. The plan was simple. I would spread word that Chen was a child molester, a charge that would make him a target for every gang in the prison. Once the other inmates turned on him, Chen would either be killed outright or forced into protective custody, where he could be reached by corrupted guards. I knew Chen wasn't a child molester. His crimes were purely financial, victimless white-collar offenses that shouldn't have made him a target for prison violence. But Morrison needed him dead, and he was asking me to make it happen. That night, lying in my cell, I finally understood what I'd become. I wasn't just a gang member trying to survive in a dangerous environment. I was part of a criminal conspiracy that was actively undermining the rule of law and destroying innocent lives for profit and power. I also realized that there was no way out. Morrison's network was too powerful, too well-connected, too thoroughly embedded in the system for any normal law enforcement response to be effective. Even if I went to the authorities with what I knew, who could I trust? How many of the people I might approach were already compromised by Morrison's network? But I couldn't bring myself to set up David Chen. Whatever else I'd become, I wasn't ready to be responsible for the death of an innocent man just to protect Morrison's interests. So I made a different choice. Instead of spreading rumors about Chen, I warned him. I told him that he was being targeted and suggested he request protective custody immediately. I didn't tell him about Morrison or the network. I couldn't risk that information getting back to the wrong people, but I gave him enough warning to save his life. Chen took my advice and requested protective custody the next day. Within a week, he'd been transferred to a federal facility where Morrison's influence was limited. The planned hit never happened, and Chen eventually did cooperate with federal investigators. Morrison knew I'd warned Chen. He didn't confront me directly, but the signs were unmistakable. My access to sensitive information was curtailed. My responsibilities were reduced. Guards who'd previously been friendly became distant and watchful. I knew I was living on borrowed time. Morrison couldn't have me killed immediately without raising suspicions, but he would find a way to eliminate the threat I represented. It was just a matter of time. That's when I made the decision that saved my life and destroyed everything I thought I knew about loyalty and honor. I contacted the FBI. The initial approach was made through my lawyer, a public defender who'd handled my appeal and who I hoped hadn't been compromised by Morrison's network. I told him I had information about corruption in the prison system and asked him to arrange a meeting with federal investigators. The meeting took place in a secure facility outside the prison, with agents from the FBI, DEA, and the Department of Justice Office of Inspector General present. I told them everything I knew about Morrison and his network, provided names and dates and locations, described the methods and the scope of the corruption. Their reaction was immediate and intense. They'd been investigating rumors of a mysterious figure called the Ghost for years, but they'd never been able to identify him or understand how his network operated. My testimony provided the missing pieces they needed to begin building a comprehensive case, but they also confirmed my worst fears about the scope of Morrison's influence. Several of the people I'd named as potential contacts turned out to be targets of ongoing internal affairs investigations. Others were subjects of grand jury proceedings that had been mysteriously stalled or derailed. "The level of corruption you're describing is unprecedented," one of the FBI agents told me. "We're talking about a criminal network that has successfully penetrated multiple levels of government and law enforcement. Building a case that can withstand legal challenge is going to take time and resources we're not sure we have." They offered me a deal: full cooperation in exchange for witness protection and a significantly reduced sentence. I would help them identify and document Morrison's network, provide testimony for prosecutions, and assist in developing strategies for dismantling the corruption. I accepted, knowing that it meant the end of any possibility of returning to my old life. I would be labeled a snitch, marked for death by every criminal organization Morrison had connections with, but I also knew it was the only way to stop what Morrison was doing and maybe prevent other people from becoming the kind of person I'd become. The investigation that followed was massive and complex. Federal agents spent months documenting the network, tracing financial transactions, intercepting communications, and building cases against dozens of corrupted officials. The evidence was overwhelming, but prosecuting the cases proved more difficult than anyone had anticipated. Morrison's network had been designed to be resistant to traditional law enforcement approaches. When key witnesses were arrested, they had limited knowledge of the overall operation. When financial records were seized, they showed legitimate transactions that concealed the real flow of money and influence. When communications were intercepted, they were coded in ways that made proving criminal intent nearly impossible. Morrison himself proved to be the most elusive target. He was clearly at the center of the network, but he'd been careful never to leave direct evidence of his involvement in specific crimes. Everything had been done through intermediaries and cutouts, creating layers of plausible deniability that made prosecution extremely difficult. But the investigation did succeed in disrupting the network and exposing much of the corruption. Dozens of guards, administrators, and officials were arrested and prosecuted. Several judges and prosecutors were forced to resign under clouds of suspicion. The prison system implemented new security protocols and oversight mechanisms designed to prevent similar corruption in the future. Morrison was eventually convicted on federal conspiracy charges and sentenced to additional time in federal prison. But everyone involved in the investigation knew that he'd probably just begin building a new network, using the lessons learned from the exposure of his previous operation to create something even more sophisticated and harder to detect. As for me, I'm now living under a new identity and witness protection, serving out the remainder of my sentence in a federal facility far from California. I've cooperated fully with ongoing investigations and testified in dozens of trials. The information I provided has led to hundreds of arrests and convictions, but I know that Morrison's network was just one example of the kind of corruption that exists throughout the American criminal justice system. Prison gangs may provide the muscle and the visible face of organized crime in correctional facilities, but the real power often lies with people who operate in shadows, who use their intelligence and connections to build influence networks that extend far beyond prison walls. The story that people tell about prison gangs, that they're tribal organizations focused on racial loyalty and territorial control, is only part of the truth. The bigger truth is that they're often tools used by more sophisticated criminal enterprises to control information, eliminate threats, and maintain the kind of order that allows corruption to flourish. John Stinson and the other visible gang leaders that people read about in newspapers and see in documentaries are real, and they're dangerous. But they're not the ones making the big decisions. They're not the ones with connections to judges and prosecutors and legislators. They're not the ones who can make evidence disappear or witnesses change their testimony. The real power in the system belongs to people like Morrison, people who understand that information is more valuable than violence, that corruption is more effective than intimidation, and that the best way to avoid prosecution is to control the people doing the prosecuting. I spent 8 years in the California prison system, and I saw how this really works. I was part of it, benefited from it, and eventually helped expose it. But I know that exposing one network doesn't solve the larger problem. There are other Morrisons out there, other networks, other systems of corruption that operate in different states and different institutions. The problem isn't any one person or any one organization. The problem is a system that creates incentives for corruption and provides opportunities for people who are smart enough and ruthless enough to exploit those opportunities. If you want to understand how organized crime really works in America, don't focus on the visible gang members or the dramatic violence that makes headlines. Focus on the quiet people, the ones who seem to have influence without obvious sources of power, the ones who operate in legal gray areas and build networks based on mutual benefit rather than tribal loyalty. Those are the people who really run the show. Those are the people who turn prisons into training grounds for more sophisticated criminal enterprises. Those are the people who corrupt the system from within while maintaining the appearance of legitimacy. Morrison taught me that the most effective criminals are often the ones who look least like criminals. They're educated, well-spoken, and understand how institutions work. They don't need to threaten people or resort to violence because they have more subtle and more effective tools at their disposal. They also taught me that corruption isn't usually about dramatic betrayals or obvious bribes. It's about small favors, gradual compromises, and the slow erosion of ethical standards that occurs when people convince themselves that everyone else is doing it and that their individual actions don't really matter. That's how Morrison built his network, not by threatening people or offering them huge sums of money, but by making himself useful to them, by solving their problems and asking for small favors in return. Over time, those small favors became larger ones, and the people involved found themselves so deeply compromised that they couldn't extricate themselves even if they wanted to. I know because that's exactly what happened to me. I started by accepting Morrison's protection when I felt threatened. I continued by providing small pieces of information that seemed harmless. I escalated by helping him recruit other people and coordinate his operations. By the time I realized what I'd become, I was so deep in the network that betraying it seemed like the only way out. Maybe that makes me a coward. Maybe I should have found the courage to resist earlier, or to walk away before I became so compromised. Maybe I should have been willing to accept the consequences of defying Morrison rather than participating in activities that I knew were wrong. But I also know that I'm not unique. The criminal justice system is full of people who started with good intentions and gradually found themselves participating in corruption because it seemed like the only way to survive or succeed. Guards who take bribes because their salaries aren't enough to support their families. Prosecutors who ignore evidence because challenging it would hurt their career. Prospects. Judges who make favorable rulings because they owe political debts to people who helped them get appointed. None of these people probably set out to become corrupt. But corruption is like quicksand. Once you start sinking, every movement you make to escape just pulls you in deeper. That's the real lesson I learned from my time with Morrison's network. The problem isn't that there are evil people who set out to corrupt the system. The problem is that the system itself creates incentives and pressures that gradually corrupt otherwise decent people. Until we address those systemic problems, the low pay for correctional staff, the political pressures on prosecutors and judges, the lack of oversight and accountability in many institutions, there will always be people like Morrison who are ready to exploit the weaknesses and build networks based on corruption rather than justice. I'm telling this story not because I think I'm a hero or because I want sympathy for the choices I made. I'm telling it because I think people need to understand how these systems really work and how easy it is for corruption to take root and spread. The visible gang members, the ones whose names and faces appear in law enforcement reports, are just the tip of the iceberg. The real threat comes from the people you never hear about, the ones who operate in shadows and build influence through intelligence rather than violence. People like Robert Morrison, who may or may not even be his real name. The man I knew as the Ghost, who taught me that the most dangerous criminals are often the ones who look least like criminals. He's probably building a new network right now, using everything he learned from the exposure of his previous operation to create something even more sophisticated and harder to detect. And somewhere, there's probably a young inmate like I was, someone who thinks they're just trying to survive, who's being gradually recruited into something they don't fully understand. I hope that person makes better choices than I did. I hope they find the courage to resist earlier, or to seek help before they become so compromised that betrayal seems like the only option. But I also hope that people on the outside, people who work in law enforcement and corrections and the courts, understand that the corruption exists and that it's more sophisticated and more pervasive than most people realize. Because the only way to stop people like Morrison is to change the systems that allow them to operate. And the only way to change those systems is to first acknowledge that they're broken and understand how that brokenness gets exploited by people who are smart enough and ruthless enough to turn corruption into a science. That's the real story of how power works in American prisons. Not through dramatic gang wars or obvious violence, but through quiet corruption and the gradual erosion of the institutions that are supposed to protect us from people like the man I became.